Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. I wanted to come and talk to you today about tendons. One of my specialist topics really. I've done a fair amount of research in tendinopathy and it's something I'm very passionate about. So today in this video we're going to talk about 4 great loading options for tendinopathy, but also an uncomfortable truth that we do need to acknowledge as well. We've got some great free resources for you, some webinars on Achilles tendinopathy and gluteal tendinopathy. So if you're interested in tendons, do make sure you check out our running resources page that you'll find the link in the description, but also in our Instagram bio as well. So check out those free webinar series and you'll learn loads about Achilles and gluteal tendinopathy. So let's dive into these 4 loading options. Let's start with the daddy, the one that most of you will know about, of course, which is eccentric loading. Now, this came about from research in the late 90s from Alfredson et al. And is still the most widely used approach for treating tendinopathy. And I'm talking mainly lower limb tendinopathy today, by the way. So we know eccentrics, they're widely used and you'll see everywhere those heel drops being used by lots of runners, lots of people with tendon pain. And it's based on this research in the 90s that got really good results with this progressive 12-week approach. Now what it involves, if you're not familiar with it, is you're actually going to do 180 reps per day. 2 exercises, 3 sets of 15 of both of them twice a day. So a straight leg heel raise and a bent leg heel raise with an emphasis on the eccentric component, the lowering component of the exercise. With the idea being that gradually as pain improves, you increase the load using a weighted backpack, typically over this 12-week program. And there is evidence to support it. There's evidence in Achilles tendinopathy and patellar tendinopathy. But there are limitations to it that we need to be aware of. A recent study by Baer et al. Found that it took on average around about 5 hours per week to do this program. So there's a huge treatment burden involved, and as a result that can affect things like patient compliance, which is a big deal, but also patient satisfaction as well. If you think about it yourself, would you want to spend 5 hours a week on the edge of a step? So it does have some issues associated with it. More recently, Stevens and Tan had a look at whether we may be able to get good results doing a lower volume program. So they compared the Alfredson approach with a more do as tolerated approach, instructing people to do just as much as they reasonably could. And they got similar results in terms of improvements in Achilles pain and function. But actually, when you look at the volume of exercise they did, they were still doing 112 reps per day on average compared to 180 reps per day in the standard eccentric protocol. So the downside is eccentrics potentially is very time consuming. I also wonder if an eccentrically biased program really addresses the concentric deficits properly. So I would say at the moment for me, I'm not tending to use eccentrically biased approaches so much. I may bring them in if a patient really likes to do something consistently every day and it's better tolerated for them in terms of their symptoms, but it isn't my #1 go-to in tendinopathy. What I prefer is option 2 that we're going to talk about, which is heavy, slow resistance training. Now this does exactly what it says on the tin. It's heavy, so it typically starts at 15 rep max and builds up to about 6 rep max over a period of 12 weeks. And it is also slow, so you include both the eccentric and concentric component here, and you do about 3 seconds for the eccentric, 3 seconds for the concentric. And that's thought to create a lot of time under tension for the tendon, which is helpful for its adaptation. Now, this is a program then you would typically do 3 times per week, and it's much less time consuming. In that Baer et al. Study that looked at it, it took around about 107 minutes per week on average, so under 2 hours compared to the 5 hours for this eccentric program that we've talked about. And that led to better compliance and better patient satisfaction in that study. And I think that's really important. If we were asking someone to do something for 12 weeks, it's really important that we can get them to do it consistently, and that's likely to lead to better results. We also think the heavy slow resistance training program leads to greater collagen turnover. And it does seem that it's the magnitude of the load, the weight that you're using, that leads to the greatest collagen adaptation. So if you're able to do that from heavy slow resistance training, if you're actually able to load more, then that in theory should lead to more adaptation. Now, what it might look like, the typical program, if I was treating someone with tendinopathy, we'd usually have maybe 3 exercises to work that particular tendon, and we'd usually do maybe 3 or 4 sets of 15 to 6 reps, depending on where they are in that sort of loading range. So if I'm treating, say, hamstring tendinopathy, proximal hamstring tendinopathy, I might have one exercise in there focusing on strengthening up the knee flexion roll of the hamstring, one or more a hip extension roll, and perhaps one with a bigger eccentric bias. And then I progress the load over time, and then gradually progress the range so they're working into deeper hip flexion positions, which are usually a bit more provocative. So that's your heavy slow resistance training option. I think it's a good option. I think it's better able probably to deal with a lot of the deficits we see in tendinopathy. Then number 3, we have isometrics. Now, isometrics, when they first kind of burst onto the scene, were being used really for an acute reduction in pain. And that's based on Ebony Rio et al.'s excellent work, where they found this huge reduction in pain using long hold isometrics. They were testing a single leg decline squat for pain, and the subject scored an average of 7 before and an average of 0 after doing isometric exercises. So that lent us to really push towards using isometrics for acute pain relief. And they may potentially have a role for that. But more recent research by Seth O'Neill and colleagues has challenged that. Now, Seth did this excellent study in 2018 where they really looked to try and replicate Ebony Rio's work. So they did the same, the 45-second heavy isometric holds, but this time in patients with Achilles tendinopathy. So they were working their calf, their plantar flexors. And what they actually found here is, rather than this dramatic reduction in pain that Ebony Rio reported, some people's pain did improve, but some people's pain actually increased. So it does seem you're going to get a much more varied response to isometrics than we might have initially thought, and that's been mirrored by other studies as well. And perhaps not a great surprise, it's very rare for one particular exercise intervention to be a cure-all for everyone. So I think we're familiar with isometrics for acute pain relief. They may have a role there. And I think the way we test that role is if in clinic you're working with a patient, you do some isometrics and it does lead to an immediate reduction in their pain, or those isometric exercises are better tolerated than maybe more dynamic options like heavy slow resistance training, I think it's perfectly reasonable to start with isometrics and use that, and then maybe progress on to another type of loading later if you want to. Now, recently we've had some research from Chris Clifford et al., which has actually found that we can use isometrics as a progressive loading option as well, potentially. Now, in this study, they recruited 23 patients with greater trochanteric pain syndrome, or gluteal tendinopathy, and they were assigned into either an isometric loading or isotonic loading group, where they did daily exercise for 12 weeks with a gradual progression in load. Now, one group did isometric exercises and the other isotonic, and they used resistance band to gradually increase the load. Both the isometric and isotonic exercises appeared to be effective for reducing pain and improving function in these patients, and there was no significant difference between the groups. Now, I like this because it opens up isometric exercise as not just a way of maybe helping acute pain, but also as an option for progressive loading. So if you have a patient who responds especially well to isometrics and finds the other exercises more provocative, why not work on progressive loading with the isometrics over a period of time and see if that can improve their results as well? So it brings in an extra option there, I think, that we wouldn't often consider. Now, my favourite approach of these 4 is a combined approach to addressing people's needs in tendinopathy. I wonder if we're using an isolated approach, either eccentric only or just isometric or perhaps just heavy slow resistance, whether we're really addressing all the needs of someone with tendon pain. because there's evidence that people with tendinopathy, they will have weakness in the muscle that works with that tendon. So the calf has been found to be weaker in people with Achilles pain. But they may also have kinetic chain deficits. So people in Achilles, with Achilles tendinopathy have been found to be weaker at the hip as well. They've often been found as well to have power and plyometric deficits too. So I'm not sure that an approach that just works on one particular exercise modality really is going to address all of those different needs. And that's where combined approaches, things like Silvernagle et al.'s work and more recently Sancho et al.'s work, I think can come in and perhaps get even better results. So let's have a look at an example of that. Now, Igor Sancho did a great study in runners with Achilles tendinopathy. Just a small feasibility study, but I think the approach that they used in this paper really is one we can perhaps look to use going forward when there's more research. They did a 4-level progressive rehab program that included isometrics and progressive calf strengthening, as well as hip strengthening to address those kinetic chain deficits we've talked about. And they also included plyometrics with hopping and gave advice on progression of running. So they're looking to bring in isometrics to strengthen up the calf and kinetic chain, but also to address plyometric issues too. So it's really hopefully catering for a number of different needs for each individual. And they found at 12 weeks that VISA-A, which is a really good outcome measure for Achilles pain, had improved by an average of 24 points. And there are increases in calf and hip strength and stiffness during hopping, plus a reduction in kinesiophobia, a fear of movement, which we think actually may be a really important part of tendinopathy. So of the approaches, I personally prefer this mixed methods approach of including perhaps some isometric exercises if they're better tolerated, of including some progressive heavy loading to build strength and tendon capacity, of maybe bringing in some exercises for the kinetic chain if you identify a weakness on assessment, and bring in some plyometric exercises at the end stage, particularly for athletes with high plyometric demands. When you're looking at sprinters, jumping athletes, they need to be able to manage those plyometric loads for a successful return to sport. And so I think that approach by Sancho et al. And others is, I think, the way to go. Also recently, we've had a nice mixed approach from Mellor et al. In the LEAP trial. They used isometric exercises or low-level activation exercises, pelvic control exercises, and progressive abductor strengthening in people with lateral hip pain, so gluteal tendinopathy predominantly. And they had an 80% success rate at 8 weeks. So we could see that combined approach can be very successful. It may be, however, that the exact method that we use isn't hugely important, as long as it works for that individual and as long as we find out a person's current capacity, where they are at the minute and where they want to be, and we can progress them gradually from where they are to where they want to be, in line with work by Cook and Docking in 2015. And if we're making that progress, we've got to make sure as we increase the load, we're monitoring their response with pain during activity and symptom response after activity. And that hopefully frees up a little bit of leeway in terms of exactly how we approach this. If multiple different ways of loading a tendon have been found to be effective, it should give us some flexibility. But what most of those approaches share in common is progressive loading and monitoring someone's response to that progressive load. Now, as said at the start of this, there's an uncomfortable truth with loading programs. And we need to acknowledge that around about 40% of patients don't get a resolution of their symptoms after loading programs alone. So while I'm a big fan of loading programs, we need to see the bigger picture. We need to look at the other things that may be influencing someone's pain. We need to guide them with a return to activity. We need to consider the effect of general health, of past medical history, of drug history, of psychosocial factors. Particularly kinesiophobia seems to be especially important, because if you have a fear of loading, it does seem to affect long-term outcomes. So loading programs are great, but they're not going to be enough on their own. We do need to think, as ever, about the bigger picture and try and really work out what's going to work for one particular individual. Okay, I look forward to reading your comments and questions shortly. I'll say bye for now.